Okay, this video is lesser known causes of autoimmune disease with the emphasis on glyphosate. Okay, this right here is a picture of a Trojan horse. You know, remember in the Trojan War when the Greeks fought against the Trojans and Odysseus made the wooden horse and the Greek soldiers hid inside the Trojan horse, and when the foolish Trojans brought it inside their city, they then came out at night and burned the city down. Okay, so basically that's what glyphosate pretty much does to humans. It's another one of these slow, insidious poisons that damage you internally in multiple different ways, including increasing the risk of autoimmune disease. Okay. And first of all, the mechanism here is very similar to what we talked about recently with fluoride. Okay, with regard to it will substitute itself into normal bonds within a molecule and disrupt the molecule of a protein, for example. So here's a protein folded, F- gets in there, and it causes breakage of all these hydrogen bonds that normally maintain the protein in the correct folded configuration. Here it looks like a whale's mouth that's closed, and here it looks like a whale's mouth that's open, if you will. But that distortion in the protein shape, if the immune system sees that, it's in the extracellular matrix outside the cell, it will attack it and cause extensive inflammation and damage. It can form antibodies to it. So these are things that can cause autoimmune disease. Autoimmune disease means that the body's own immune system is attacking itself, like with antibodies, for example. Okay, so here's the situation with glyphosate. All right, first of all, there's glycine. I'll often call it glyphosate. Glycine here is the smallest amino acid. Every amino acid has a central alpha carbon, and it's always attached to a carboxylic acid. Therefore, it's called an amino acid. Okay, but it has an amino group on it, NH2, and that's why it's called an amino acid. All right, then there's always going to be one hydrogen attached to the alpha carbon, but then the variable is the R group. And this R group, the smallest it could possibly be, is to be just a hydrogen. And when it's just a hydrogen for the side chain, that's called glycine. So it is the smallest of all the amino acid, and that ends up being a very big deal because a lot of times you need an amino acid to be small. Let's say you have an enzyme binding pocket. You want the smallest possible thing in there sometimes if you have to fit in a big substrate to carry out a chemical reaction. Well, the relevance is that this glyphosate can substitute itself into proteins where glycine should be. It's also got, two hydrogens on the alpha carbon. It's got the carboxylic acid here. It's got a nitrogen. But what's different about this is, I'm going to call it GP from now on. GP also has this big honking phosphate group on there. That's a major big deal because this is going to have a strong negative charge on it. And the negative charge here is going to be very disruptive to the proteins that it gets substituted into. So for example, let's say you've got an ion channel and you want that ions can enter a cell. So the ion channel being a plasma membrane. If you've got a glycine, it'll have just this tiny little hydrogen sticking into the ion channel and the ions can get through. But if you throw that phosphate in there, that's going to mess up the ion channel. Not only is it bulky, it's also got a negative charge on it. Okay. Especially, let's say you have a protein where there's one glycine here and there's another glycine or some small molecule like a valine, for example, or an alanine. You can substitute in an adjacent glyphosate, and that's the spot where it characteristically occurs. What are some of the problems with that? Not only can you induce autoimmune disease where the body attacks itself, you can also induce immune suppression if you damage proteins that are part of the immune system. For example, there's an important enzyme in white blood cells called NADPH oxidase. Usually it's abbreviated NOx, N-O-X. By the way, TL stands for Toxic Legacy, and that's a page number 148. That book was written by Stephanie Seneff, PhD. She's from MIT, and her book is called Toxic Legacy. It's a very good book. It's basically the biochemistry of GP. So by inhibiting the NOx enzyme, and it also inhibits a complement protein called C1q, those are both needed to kill bacteria and viruses as well as to remove debris from dead cells. All these things are an important function in the immune system. And you see how you can have a schizophrenic immune response. On the one hand, you'll have an increase in immune activity with autoimmune disease, attacking the body's normal tissue because of these problems here. And number two, you're going to have a suppression of the immune system, be less able to fight off bacteria and viruses. And you know what else can do something similar to this is estrogen, okay? Estrogen, we talked about it, when a woman's pregnant, it's a little bit like having a transplant. You've got foreign DNA inside your body. And so estrogen levels get very high during pregnancy, and they contribute to this complex immune response whereby the immune system is suppressed towards the baby. So if you look at autoimmune disease, about 80% of them are in women. Women have much more autoimmune disease than men do. And part of that is thought due to elevation of estrogen and estrogenic chemicals. Okay, so here we're talking about glyphosate. The reason I mentioned all that estrogen stuff was the sense that glyphosate has a double effect. It's like a schizophrenic effect. Too much in some areas with the autoimmune component, too little in other areas, less able to fight off infection. So it's bad. It's double bad in that sense. Okay, so what's the teaching point from this? Why am I going through all this? Because what I'm trying to say is that some people will tell you, oh, organic's no big deal. No, organic is a big deal because organic food, USDA certified organic, means you're not allowed to spray GP on the food. You're also not allowed to spray atrazine, which is the highly estrogenic form of a herbicide. GP is the one that blocks the shikimate pathway in the gut bacteria, but it turns out it also gets much more involved in humans and other animals than was previously thought. If you look at collagen here, collagen's about 1/3 of the proteins in the human body. It's like the scaffold for the entire human body. You can also describe it as being the glue that holds us together in a flexible way so that we're youthful, dynamic, flexible, and strong. All right, every third residue is a glycine, and it makes this molecule quite vulnerable to have GPs substituted in for the glycines. And when that occurs, they will distort the shape of the collagen. Collagen typically binds in a triple helix, 1, 2, 3 components all wrapped around each other. So let's say here's my 3 pens, okay, and a marker. They'd be all wrapped around each other, and they have to twirl around each other and stay tight, kind of like a 3-part rope like you see on those tension bridges, you know, Golden Gate Bridge or something. Anyways, the point is when GP substitutes for glycine, it distorts the shape of the protein, and in the extracellular space outside of cells, the immune system will see it and will potentially react to it and cause an inflammatory response to destroy it and remove it as debris, as a foreign protein that shouldn't be there. You can call these things DAMPs or PAMPs. PAMPs means pathogen-associated molecular pattern, thinking it's related to a bacteria or virus, or simply DAMPs, damage-associated molecular pattern, meaning that the immune system recognizes debris, dead tissue, necrotic tissue, and it will remove it. Okay, so the point I'm saying is if you mess up the collagen in the human body and then you incite an inflammatory response, which is going to lead to laying down of more scar tissue, the body becomes stiff. Like old people tend to be real stiff in their movements, some of them. Okay, let's see. So Sena's research and summary of the research shows that it appears to be causing an autoimmune reaction against collagen. You can read here, TL's Toxic Legacy, page 149, if you want to look this stuff up. It's an easy book to read. Well, it's not an easy book to read. It's like all biochemistry, but it's a good book. Okay, that lady, she's got a whole bunch of YouTube videos. You can watch her videos. But the same problem with the collagen. You know, collagen is part of your joint cartilage, and it can cause stiffness in your joints. It can cause back pain. I actually think this is a major contributor to DISH, diffuse idiopathic skeletal hyperostosis, which I've talked about before and I think is primarily an ischemic phenomenon, but F- and GP also contribute to it because they damage collagen, all right? And the vitamin C deficiency with scurvy can contribute to it because you need vitamin C for making collagen. All right, so yeah, here are things that disrupt collagen function. I talked about F-, talked about GP, talked about scurvy. Things in general that can be harmful. Alcohol, tobacco, caffeine are bad. Advanced glycation, end products of diabetes. All this stuff is bad. All right, but the reason I'm going through all this and the stuff about autoimmune disease, there's a lot of people who have autoimmune disease, and the smart move, of course, is go low-fat, low-sodium vegan, whole food vegan. But if you're still not completely getting better as well as you can, go through my list of everything to minimize and avoid to minimize your risk of leaky gut. But don't forget about these things because I think they matter. I know they matter. How much they matter for you as an individual, that's variable. But knowing that there's other mechanisms of autoimmune disease besides just leaky gut is good to know. Okay, so now we're going to get a little more into what's happening with GP. First of all, we're going to talk about how enzymes work. So you have substrates. So this is to be substrate number 1, substrate number 2. They are the things that are going to react together in a chemical reaction. Then you have an enzyme, which is a catalyst, lowers the activation energy of the process. And then there's a transition state where thing 1 is bound to thing 2, substrate 1 to substrate 2. and then the chemical reaction occurs. In this case, this green thing in the middle with an outward projecting thing on there started out being bound to thing 1, and now it ends up being bound to thing 2. So those are the products of the chemical reaction. Enzyme has a characteristic fit for the substrates. It originally was described as being a lock, a key within a lock, okay, but then they realized it's a little bit more like a hand in a glove, that there's a slight shape change when the substrates bind to the enzyme, like a glove changes shape when you put your hand in it a little bit. And then it's also important that it binds in the correct way. One point I would make is it's almost also a lot of times like there's a magnet inside of that the active site. So the active site of the enzyme is the part that binds the substrates. And what I just said was a key point. There's often a charge in there. Let's say I'm binding positively charged substrates. There'll often be a negatively charged amino acid side chain within the active site of the enzyme. So it's like a magnet. It'll suck the positively charged substrate into the active site by its charge attraction as well as its perfect fit. Okay? So here would be an enzyme where the substrates have, the enzyme active site is too big for the substrates, and they don't orientate correctly towards each other once they're in there. Here's the perfect fit, whereby the thing 1 and thing 2, substrate 1 and 2, fit into the active site of the enzyme, and it holds them into the proper configuration so they can react together and form the desired products. Okay, so again, here's an active site with a negative charge in it. In this case, the carboxylic acid is sticking up there and it's deprotonated, creating a negative charge on the oxygen. Okay, here's basically what an enzyme does, is it lowers the energy state of the transition phase. Okay, so what this does is it makes it possible for this reaction to occur. If you had to crank the energy up so high, you know, you'll almost never get the reaction. An enzyme that functions well can increase the speed of reaction a millionfold. That's what enzymes do. Okay, this is just from Stephanie Seneff. She's the author of the book Toxic Legacy, and I think it's a great book. And she's just talking about how glyphosate, GP, can substitute itself for glycine, and it'll mess up proteins. It's coding for glycine in the body, but this tricks the body because it's got 2 hydrogens on the alpha carbon, so it can sneak in, especially if the adjacent amino acid is small, leaving some room for this big honking phosphate tail to flop over. If there was something big and bulky here, especially with a negative charge, it would say get lost. It wouldn't let the GP get in. But when this site next to it is small, has a small side chain, that enables the GP to substitute itself in for glycine. And that's called the characteristic motif or theme, which enables GP to sneak into proteins. And this is a very common thing in the human body. So that's why I think this is another insidious poison, kind of like F-, that it can get into all kinds of places and destroy a lot of things. And these things can accumulate over time to do damage. So let's say here's a normal active site in an enzyme with a glycine side chain, just a little hydrogen that's hardly going to take up any space, and a real small adjacent amino acid like alanine, real tiny. And because of this, GP can substitute in for this glycine, and its bulkiness will have room because alanine is also pretty small. It'd be even smaller side chain if you had another glycine, 2 glycines in a row. Anyways, now this, you're supposed to have a glycine in this enzyme active site, but instead you got a GP. Look at this giant bulky phosphate. That's going to be a phosphorus molecule attached to the 3 oxygens coming off there, and that's going to have a powerful negative charge on it. It's all bulky. It's going to mess up this enzyme. The substrates aren't going to be able to get in there to react, so the enzyme is dysfunctional, and the shape of the protein might change, which could make it trigger an autoimmune reaction. So this is the point I'm making, that you can do diffuse, widespread, insidious damage, that's happening every day if a person keeps eating this non-organic food. So what is GP sprayed on? GP is especially sprayed on soy. That's one of the reasons why I'm not a fan of soy. I know that it's like the cool, popular thing to say soy, but in my opinion, anybody who strongly recommends soy to me is somebody who either doesn't know nutrition or they're BSing you. There's a ton of papers showing problems with it, okay? And it's much worse, of course, if it's GMO with all this GP stuff sprayed on it. It's for chumps. Okay, and then the GP gets sprayed on other things too. If it doesn't say organic on there, it could be sprayed on there. And it's also sometimes sprayed before harvest to facilitate leaf drop-off, and that's done especially like in Canada where there's a shorter growing season. So you definitely want organic. Trust me on that one. Read the book. You'll be amazed. The Toxic Legacy book. Okay, we talked about glycine being every third residue on collagen, and that can contribute to arthritis, back pain, and all those problems. There's tons of spots. So, like I said, don't be a chump. Eat organic, and if you have to eat something that's not organic, try to make it something that GP doesn't get sprayed on. Otherwise, it can come in like a Trojan horse and cause chronic, slow, insidious damage. And the fact that it's slow and insidious damage, people don't realize it. Just like F minus, you might not notice a problem in the first, couple months or years, but down the road there'll be a decline in overall health that you really don't want. So this is another mechanism of autoimmune disease. Smart move is avoid GP by eating 100% organic. And if you have to eat non-organic, eat the foods that don't spray GP on it.